It's really important to be able to name and describe your enemy. Super important. Now, this has profound meaning for President Trump, who is up against a deep state that is already burrowing in. Maybe you saw that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has renamed their chief diversity officer's title. She's just now a senior executive. Other departments are renaming departments. Their Department of Special Focus, special programs. So it's bureaucratic game playing, and they're very good at that. So many of these people are lawyers, so they're good at lawyering. But this also has profound spiritual value. If you don't study your enemy, you can't have a hope of defeating your enemy. This is why football teams watch film time and time and time again of the opposing team. This is why if your enemy is yourself in a sport like CrossFit, the professionals in that sport watch themselves on film time and time and time again, even on the very basics, the turnover on a snatch. So let's take a look at the CIA from a documentary that came out several years ago. And it proves that it is okay. The Supreme Court says it's perfectly fine for the CIA to mentally torture people and to poison them. And they did this in Canada. So we'll talk about this with the help of Bulwark Capital Management, KnowYourRiskRadio.com, and only through the great permission and the supplying of mercy from God Almighty.
The Todd Herman Show is 100% disapproved by big pharma, technocrats, and tyrants everywhere. No. From the high mountains of free America, here's the Emerald City exile, Todd Herman.
Today is a day the Lord has made, and these are the times to which God has decided we shall live. I think like I should do a radio thing here. I just have a need to do a radio thing. Can I do a radio thing real quick? Welcome back to the Todd Herman Show. See, that's how we do it. Welcome back. The CIA is willing to do just about anything. And this is important because President Trump is up against these people. As I say, they're already burrowing in. The fact that all these government departments are renaming their DEI and they're shifting people's titles. Oh, it's not DEI. It's the project. It's the Special Projects Division. It's the Having Fun Division. And we knew this was coming because the die was cast with Barack Hussein Obama's 1,500 lawyers or whatever, who the first time around showed so-called civil servants how to disregard the orders of the president. Now, Trump is playing a different game this time, as in, hey, we're not joking, and they're going to play the word game, we'll play the word game. But this is so burrowed into American society that the CIA and other deep staters have convinced themselves that it is only their opinion that matters because they're the great experts. And they've got help, of course, with academia. We're going to talk about a CIA program that occurred in Canada but came out of the United States. And I'm going to give you an update on this. It literally involved the poisoning of people's minds with the actual goal being brainwashing. And as part of MK Ultra. We know this went on in the United States. We know they gave people LSD in the United States. We know they did this without telling them. In Canada, people actually went in to get mental health treatment for things like postpartum depression. And they were put through this program, and they were literally, purposely, psychologically tortured. And I don't know that you ever heard about the lawsuit with this. Now, if you're listening and not watching, it's really important that you go over to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@the-Todd-Herman-Show, and watch this because it's the faces of the people who were affected. So I hope you will do that because it's vitally important. Let me start with just framing this in terms of American society. There was a class a few years ago at the University of Washington. This was in the 2019, and it's an undergrad research class. And let me just give you the class synopses, and let me then clarify what they don't tell the students. A declassified 1962 document shows that the Kennedy administration considered Operation Northwoods a plan to fabricate terror attacks and blame it on the Cuban government in order to legitimize an invasion of Cuba. The Northwoods plan was rejected by President Kennedy. This tactic of faking an attack for political purposes is called a false flag attack. Modern conspiracy theorists use Operation Northwoods as evidence that the American government fakes terror attacks in the 21st century. So she goes on to mention September 11th, 2001, and the Parkland shooting, and Alex Jones is false. And I know he's apologized for that, and he should, but he also shouldn't be bankrupt for making a mistake. That shooting. And then she writes, I analyzed the impact of this document in the conspiracy fringe, looking for at its reference in various new media spaces, such as the online conspiracy editorial InfoWars and the alt-right social media platform Gab. So all the titles she gets to choose. Here's what she doesn't tell her students. When President Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods, it's only because he found out about it. Because one of the people in the deep state apparatus looked at that and said, this is insane. They were talking about allowing, or in fact, killing American troops here. So who was the target of Operation Northwoods? JFK. He was the target of the PSYOP. They wanted to be able to go to JFK and say, this guy, this what happened here was a terror attack by Cuba. They wanted to trap JFK into a war. Now just fancy that. Just fancy that. And war is a very serious thing. I have friends who fought them. My friend Tim I can say his name. He's my friend Tim Cruikshank, founder and CEO of Bone Frog Coffee. He went on 3 deployments on our behalf. How do you think Tim would know or feel if it learned that this was all a PSYOP, where he lost brothers in combat, and it was all a PSYOP? I think he might feel pretty angry. I think that show, The Terminalist, might take on a new meaning. Now, Tim went a different direction with his life. He came back and he founded Bone Frog Coffee, which is a partner in the show. Just love these guys. I used to just take coffee as a carriage system for caffeine. I didn't care how it tasted. And then I had Bone Frog Coffee. I said, wait a minute, coffee can taste good? I drink the Goat Locker blend by preference. It is a dark roast with none of the bitterness that you'd experience in other coffees. It took Tim's team 3 years of experimentation to get this right. So try this. Go to bonefrogcoffee.com/Todd. You get 10% off your first purchase, 15% off subscription coffee. And don't be offended. I mean, I don't want to freak you out, but the bags say God Country Team, so you might want to hide them because you might freak out your neighbors. bonefrogcoffee.com/Todd. So that's how academia treats things like conspiracy theories. So here's my theory. And we'll go through this op that they pulled off in Canada, this brainwashing experiment. Here's my theory. An organization willing to do this is willing to do anything. They don't see any morality. They don't see any limits on their powers. They absolutely see people as devices to be used to increase the power of the power structure. This is what Trump is up against. They're already, in my judgment, psyoping Trump, with Larry Ellison coming along and saying AI is going to cure you in 48 hours. So this program began in Canada, and this is an older documentary. So A, if you're watching this, please forgive the footage. This is what was state of the art at the time. B, the sounds, again, was state of the art at the time. And isn't it interesting that this isn't a movie? Because this should be a movie. The genesis of this program.
Convinced the Soviets and Chinese had perfected brainwashing during the Korean War, the agency sought to perfect its own techniques, both to protect its agents and to use as a weapon.
Who did you meet with in the safe house?
The CIA man overseeing the project was John Gittinger.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
This was run under the auspices of a doctor you'll hear about here, and under a front group called the Society for Protection of Human Psychology.
Dr. Elliot Emanuel knew Cameron.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
It's talking about Dr. Ewan Cameron, who created this op and ran this op under the auspices of this thing called the Society for Protection of Human Psychology, an American organization, front group for the CIA, black op funding, and they take this across the border to Canada. So one of the methods that they pushed on people is called psychic driving. That sounds fun. I want to be psychically driven, don't you?
At Ravenscraig, Dr. Cameron went further with drugs and electric shock treatments than any of the U.S. researchers in the MK Ultra project dared. His aim was to wipe the mind clean. Then he would implant new messages by forcing the patient to listen to a hypnotic repetition as many as 250,000 times. This was called psychic driving. Most of the drugs used in the program were experimental, and some dangerous. There was the tranquilizer Artane, a paralysis-inducing anectine, and curare, which pygmies tipped their arrows with to paralyze victims. Bulbocapnan, another experimental tranquilizer, and lysergic acid diethylmide, the hallucinogen LSD. In her room at Ravenscraig, Mrs. Orlico waited for her first treatment.
So these are women largely, and there were some men who did this too, who went in again for things like postpartum depression. And they thought they were going to the best doctors in the world to get the best treatment in the world. Oh, by the way, they ended up paying for the so-called treatment. But not everybody was jazzed about this. One lady said, yeah, I don't think I was that excited. I felt a little reticent.
I saw a tray with hypodermic, with a needle, a syringe. And the card on it had my name, so I looked a little more closely. And it was lysergic acid diethylamide. And my husband was a druggist, and I knew a lot of drugs, but I'd never heard of that one. And so I phoned a friend and who was a psychiatric nurse, and I said, do you know what it is? And she said, I never heard of it. But she had a friend who was a psychiatrist. So she phoned her friend, and she called me back, and she said, he said that this stuff causes poisonous psychosis. She said he said not to take it. Well, I thought, you know, he's a very Freudian psychiatrist and doesn't believe in any medication of any kind. And after all, here's Dr. Cameron. I mean, he's the big doctor, and he's, you know, he's known all over the world, and he wouldn't do anything that would harm me, etc. And so I took the injection. And I didn't like it. And it really did create a poisonous psychosis.
So the CIA was willing to do this, and there's much, much more to this story. And this story, and we'll get into this. I want you to hear about some of the effects and this lawsuit, but please step back from the history and live in the modern era. She just described the appeal to authority methodology. Well, how do people get away with this? They make themselves mythical authorities. I mean, doctors are authorities at things, for sure. But they make themselves into these myths like Tony Fauci did. And this is so utterly powerful, really, because we have been trained, and not trained, that would be formalized, but we've been programmed to respect, for instance, the white coat. And that's all part of the profession and its trust. And why do you think they used white coats? Free of disease, clean, as pure as snow. That's why they did that. So when you are faced with some cognitive dissonance and you're dealing with the doctor, it's just this lady going, wow, I don't think I want to have LSD in my mind. I don't think I want to get injected with this stuff. But then again, this is the greatest doctor in the world. You can extend this into, of course, the lies of gender theory. Your sex is not defined by your genitalia, so we need to change your genitalia. Wait, that doesn't make sense, but they're the best doctors in the world. Likewise, with the deep state telling lies. I mean, when they came out and said that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation, how did people believe that? Because they were the authorities. Because they have titles. 51 former intelligence officials. Officials. That's a powerful word, officials. I remember the first time I saw myself referred to in the press as a Microsoft executive. I laughed. I giggled. And then I got sick. I'm not an executive. I don't executive anybody. But there's that honorific. One of the things I think that President Trump is doing so well is, of course, stripping the access to intelligence and the top secret clearance of these people who lied. But I think there's something else that we need to do is play this game back to them of this appeal to authority game. Don't call them intelligence officials anymore. And on the switching of titles that they're doing, or this no longer diversity, then let's wind this down even harder, ratchet it down even harder. Every single executive job will be for review. You will describe, in a crisp sense, every single executive job. To me, that's the only way to really restrain the deep state. And there's a lot more to this, including the patients and their experiences, the lawyers. If you're just listening to this and not watching it, go see the whole thing on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@the-Todd-Herman-Show. So there was a certain patient who went into this all, and her name is Huard, Mrs. Huard. Now, she's one of many patients who came together in a lawsuit to stop this abuse. And in a second, I want you to hear what she talks about and what they did to her. And we'll get back in and we'll talk about psychic driving, what that was like, some examples of what they did to people, really important stuff. And as you're going through this, just think through things like gender theory, things like masking, things like your own government telling you that eating sugared breakfast cereal is just as good or maybe even preferable to eating steak because they did that. Why? Why would they want us to believe eating Frosted Flakes is as good for you as eating a steak? Could it be because they want us to be weak-minded? Could it be because they want us to be addicted to sugars? Could it be because they want us to be type 2 diabetics? Because type 2 diabetics are the perfect human experiment. Why? Because in your young ages where you're working and contributing to the economy as a worker bee, you are not a useless eater. And dang it, you spend a lot of money. Because as a type 2 diabetic, you're going to eat a lot more foods. As a type 2 diabetic, you're going to need insulin. As a type 2 diabetic, you're going to think you need insulin. What you need to do is control your body mass and get exercise, etc. But that's not the way they play this. And then when you reach a certain age, type 2 diabetes is going to kill you young. So you don't end up with Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which they know they bankrupted. It's the perfect setup. That's part of why I just so sadly question the American healthcare system. because such obvious things are ignored. For instance, how often have you heard from a doctor, hey, you know what? I could give you some pills to make you feel better, but do you spend any time outside? Do you get any vitamin D? And let's check your vitamin D levels. Do you ever get that from doctors? Because you know what? Being short on vitamin D or C, that can drive all sorts of problems with you. Do they ever like really consult you on your diet, like what you eat? How much water do you drink? Have you ever had a doctor say to you, do you track how much water you drink? I haven't, not once. Because that's not their job. Their job is to have you leave with something you buy through the great psyop of so-called insurance, which is cost shifting. This is why I am a firm believer in going outside the insurance complex anytime you can. And look, I get it. It's expensive. Trust me, I know this. But if your life is in the balance, your ability to walk, your ability to have movement in any form of joy and movement, your ability to avoid being cut open for a surgery, your ability to recover from a traumatic brain injury, if that all hangs in the balance and your insurance company is telling you got to get cut open, got to get on pills, that's the only option, they're lying. It's not. So in balance, it might well be worth the expense to go to Renew.healthcare. Now, in my judgment, it is worth it. So do this. If you're being told you have to have surgery, more pills, or the pain's just going to last, or there's no recovery for this traumatic brain injury, just go to Renew.healthcare, RENUE.healthcare, and they will see if they can help you. They'll show you how they can get access to your MRI results. They use ethically gathered stem cells, never anything to do with abortion. And these stem cells are just sitting there ready to build things. They're just buzzing with energy. I just want to build things. So cartilage, muscle, tendons, and they always go in and destroy inflammation, which a lot of times is what makes you feel better and get better. Go to Renew.healthcare. It's RENUE.healthcare. So at Ravenswoods, and if you saw the image of that building, ain't that a fun image? That's exactly what you'd expect it to be. Mrs. Huard went in for treatment, and she talked with the documentary makers about what was done to her.
Mrs. Huard, like the others, was forced to pay for the so-called treatment, massive electric shocks, and all the drugs.
They would give me as much as 40 pills a day, and I would ask the nurse, what is that? They would say it's a new drug, and they only name it by a number.
What did all those drugs do to you?
How did they make
Well,
you feel?
I was very, very strong, well-powered. So these drugs kind of desensitize me. They would lower my reactions. They would lower my resistance.
Lowering inhibitions. So they go in for treatment for postpartum depression or depression in general or confusion or brain fog. And they want to lower their inhibitions. Let's think back. Just compare this to what has happened to people in hospital protocols. Lowering inhibitions is one big part of the deep state's game in terms of the Overton window. Constant repetition, say, for instance, of phrases like migrants, 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 migrants. Well, who's going to be against a migrant? We're all migrants. And, of course, the disappearance of the word illegal. Remember when they did immigrants? That was the phrase immigrants, and we knew they meant illegal immigrants. Well, they know we knew that, so they changed the phrase to migrants. It's lowering mental inhibition. It's clouding minds so that people can't see clearly what's going on. It's flooding the zone. Right now, President Trump's team is doing a brilliant job of flooding the zone. All these executive orders coming out at once, all these moves coming out at once. I don't want to see the Gulf of Mexico be the Gulf of America. I think that's silliness. And it's a shiny thing for the media to try to run with. They're doing something incredibly important. They are making it difficult for the deep state to create the next 2-minute hate, to focus people on something to specifically hate, because there's so many things they could chase. That's brilliant. So what are they doing? They're going back to J6. No real people care about that. Beltway types do. That's the only thing they have. I was listening to the Mockingbird Media this morning. Coming in, there's a television station that simulcasts on radio. It's Channel 4 out of Spokane, Washington. And I listened to this, and I'm, okay, what are the talking points? Migrants. Making sure migrants are safe. Because the Trump administration doesn't think migrants should be safe. So migrant safety groups, that's a new phrase. And that lowers mental inhibition. Well, I can't be against this group. They're just here for migrant safety. Now, are they drugging us? I don't think they're drugging us in whole, except go back to food supply. Go back to 30% of Americans on psychotropic drugs for things like, a serotonin reuptake problem, which apparently they've never proven. May not be there. So in Canada, Mrs. Huard and other patients went in for treatment, and she was put through psychic driving. And again, please forgive the sound quality and the video quality. These guys did exactly what they could at the time. This was state of the art at the time, and at least they did this. And am I wrong, or should this be a major blockbuster movie?
Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why?
So a reel-to-reel tape recorder playing as this woman is sleeping, and remember, sleeping while drugs. With her inhibitions removed, resistance removed.
I would try very strongly not to let my mind be capturing all the messages, but they would lower my resistance so much with the heavy drugs, but I couldn't do otherwise than listen.
Did you ever ask them how any of this was making you better?
No, I didn't ask questions. I was just say, I don't want to go through it again. And I would cry. I didn't want it, I knew it. Way down in my heart, I knew it wasn't good. But, how could you fight? You're in a hospital where it's supposed to be the best, with the best doctors, so what can you do?
And before people say, weak, weak woman, remember what people wore on their faces when they walked into restaurants until they sat down. Appeal to authority is a very powerful thing. And you get into a situation like this where you feel trapped, and they construct this in a way for you to feel trapped. Or let's put this in a more common day experience. I've shared with you where I was living in Washington, D.C., and got pulled into one of those license and insurance check things, just one of those stop and talk things. And I saw it coming. I was with a friend of mine. We were driving in from Virginia to go to, I don't remember where we were going to, but something in downtown Washington, D.C., and they were siphoning all the cars off on the side of the freeway. And we pull up, and an officer comes up to the window, and I kind of rolled my window down about a quarter of the way. He goes, "Can you roll your window down the rest of the way?" I said, "No, I can hear you fine, officer. Thank you." He goes, "Okay, just need to see your license, registration, and insurance, please." "All right, am I being detained?" "I just need we're just doing a quick check tonight. Just doing a quick check of license, registration, insurance. Could you get that out for me, please?" "Yeah, just as soon as you tell me if I'm being detained." And the officer does this. License and registration, proof of insurance, now. "Yeah, just as soon as you tell me I'm being detained." "Am I being detained?" "Pull over up there. You're blocking people. Pull over." "I can hear you fine here." And then he does this thing. He does this, goes, and indicating that, man, I'm about to give you a good solid beating. And he pulls over a sergeant or someone in charge, patrol lieutenant, who comes over, and he's roll the window down. I can hear you fine, officer. Give me your license, registration, proof of insurance now. Am I being detained? He does this. Are you a lawyer? Because I was dressed in a suit, because that's D.C. and the business I was in politics. What was he looking for? Org chart. His appeal to authority wasn't working. The badge, the gun, it wasn't working. So he was going to do a status check. Are you a lawyer? And I said, no, I'm not. And then my buddy looked at his watch and he goes, I am. Are we being detained? And the officer was furious. Get out of here. So we drive away. Now, we were two men in a car with a fairly solid knowledge of the Constitution and our rights in the legal process. This was a woman brought in here, not already in not strong mental shape, facing all these white coats, all these authorities. And there's a lot of people who are not willing to speak up like that because the authorities will get mad at you. I had a friend of mine refuse to have his baby given all these shots. And a nurse screamed at him. And his wife was grabbing his arm. We better do this. When the nurse left the room and his wife was grabbing his arm, going, we better do this. They're mad. And my buddy's lived in Idaho his whole life. He's sort of Idaho man. He goes, I don't care. I don't care if they're mad. They can't make us do it. So when you are drugged, though, things become a lot harder. This is what President Trump is up against. These people are willing to do this to these women. They're willing to do anything to anybody. And appeal to authority is so very, very strong that this can explain a lot of the activities in Washington, D.C. Why do people do this? Why would people keep a person who simply walked through the Capitol through open doors, took a couple of selfies, and then left? Why would anybody participate in holding that person in prison for 4 years? There's this woman from Idaho who's refusing her pardon. She won't take it because she says, I'm not guilty. I don't need a pardon. I didn't do anything wrong. I walked through open doors. I took some pictures and I left. I wasn't violent. I didn't break anything. I was welcomed in. No cop stopped me. Everybody else was walking in. I did nothing wrong. It's my property. I don't want your pardon. Keep me in prison. So she's very strong-minded. So how is it that people will do these things? Because appeal to authority goes all the way up to the top. Because just like Mrs. Huard, they're afraid to say no. And there's more to this because there's a lawsuit. And I'm going to give you an update on the lawsuit. An update on the lawsuit that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and wasn't huge news. How could this not be huge news? Because the power system didn't want it to be the huge news. And look, there's good people within the power system. As I talked about the other day, there's good people at these big corporate entities, but appeal to authority. There's good people at companies that make great big soap. And then there's the great big soap that comes out of that, which is not good for you. It's got chemicals. If it's made in China, I wouldn't count on it not being made by slave labor. And I would suggest that the companies that make that soap probably don't care about your values and probably don't match your values. And I would suggest to you that soap is such a kind of, unforgive me, but boring thing that most people aren't going to give a lot of mental energy into, why do I use this soap? So I'm asking you to give just a little bit of mental energy to this. If you had a chance to have better soap that is made in America, that's all natural, no chemicals, made by a family, not an entity, a family with 3 generations of soap-making expertise, and a company that has at its heart a focus on something far more important than soap, which is the lives of young people who the party would have wanted aborted. Used to be 1 young person, Allen, now it's 3 young people at Allen Soaps. So if you had the opportunity to actually use soap that supports your values, would you? If you would, then do. Go to allensoaps.com/Todd. That's allensoaps.com/Todd. You get 10% off all the products there, and you're backing a company that agrees with you that all lives do matter. So there was a member of parliament in Canada. His name is David Arlecko, and he got involved in this entire mess, and he talked about the cost. The cost. Yeah, they were forced to pay for this. A PSYOP by the CIA in Canada was a profit-making enterprise for the so-called doctors involved. Does that sound familiar?
We had Blue Cross coverage, but we didn't have, but Blue Cross did not cover treatment in a mental hospital. So what we did after the first year was to sell the house, which was really the only money that we had. And my daughter and I moved in with Al's mother. And we stayed there almost 3 years. It was tough, but the financial cost was really a small part of the cost. If you're talking about cost, it really disrupted our lives.
Mrs. Orlico sued the Allen Memorial Institute, and last year it quietly settled out of court for $50,000. But that's only the amount she estimates she had to pay for what she thought was treatment. Apart from giving Mrs. Orlico her money back, the Allen has done nothing to compensate Cameron's other victims.
50 grand for being tortured. Simply paying her back for the payments she made for the service of being tortured. We have to understand our enemy. The devil wants to mentally torture you in small ways and in big ways. He doesn't particularly care how he moves you away from the Lord, because the path is wide that leads to destruction. All sorts of ways to destroy you. The path is narrow that leads to everlasting life. Understanding our enemy. President Trump needs to understand the enemy, and I think he does a lot better this time. An enemy that on day one begins to burrow in and change titles, hiding programs, hiding funding. They're all, well, not all, but many of them are doing that now. They want to operate in the dark, just like Satan wants to operate in the dark. He wants to find areas in your life where there's deep pain and poke at it, or fantastic pleasure and promote it. This is what you're made for. The deep state is creating pain and creating strife, just like the enemy. So the CIA actually wrote a letter to the Allen Institute. And this is vitally important because it gets us near to the update on this lawsuit.
The CIA wrote the Allen this recently declassified letter. Addressed to Maurice Danger,
January 29,
then director,
1980.
it said, "It has been our understanding that there are no remaining records of Dr. Cameron's research that might reveal the identities of patients under his care during the time period in question. However, by way of leaving no stone unturned, we now inquire whether this information might be reconstituted through patient records, financial records, or other hospital records. Sincerely yours, Daniel B. Silver, General Counsel, CIA." So even the CIA made some effort to find the victims, but little help from Montreal.
So the people in Canada would not cooperate, or they knew that that was a cover. The CIA was covering themselves. Oh, we tried to find the victims. We wrote a strongly worded letter to the organization that got paid to carry this out with CIA money. So a bunch of these people teamed up and they sued and they went to court, and they have all the proof in the world of what was done to them. They've got the people who ran the program talking about the program. They got the CIA's letter. Oh, by the way, the government of Canada was apparently given also an apology from the CIA, an apology, and they chose not to share that with the lawyers. The CIA acknowledges, yeah, we apologized. We sent Canada a letter, and the Canadian authorities chose not to share that with the lawyers. So these are the lawyers who represented these victims.
The CIA intimidates many American law firms, but this case is being fought by a lawyer who defended Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller during the McCarthy witch hunts for communists.
Well, I just pause. It wasn't a witch hunt. There were and are communists in our system. But then again, that's just one thing they got wrong.
In preparation, the lawyers have interrogated every CIA agent involved in MK Ultra, including former director Helms. With the trial expected to start soon, Joseph Raw sums up the case with his junior partner, James Turner.
What we get out of Gittinger? John Gittinger is the former CIA staff agent who testified that at his request, the CIA contacted Cameron and informed him that a front in New York would support his work. As a result of that, Cameron received CIA funds to finance the LSD and brainwashing experiment.
In other words, Cameron, all he did was what the CIA was in effect asking him to do.
Yeah.
And what he said he was going to do, and he did it. And
then they paid him money for it.
And then what about Gottlieb now? We got a lot of stuff out of Gottlieb. Here's one of his depositions. We got him, I take it. He said, I'm going to wash my hands of this. I'm approve the project, but I don't have to take care of the Canadian citizens who are going to be affected. Is that fair?
That's fair. He admitted that they took no steps whatsoever to guarantee that people wouldn't be injured if it could be avoided, or to make sure that people even knew that they were participating in an experiment.
Well, this guy Gottlieb's got quite a record, doesn't he, on negligent action ahead of time. I mean, before this ever...
He was personally involved in an experiment that resulted in the death of a U.S. Army...
Is that the one where they put the LSD in the Cointreau of a guy named Olson?
Yeah, and then he jumped out of a window in New York City. They managed to cover that up, too.
I like a man who was general counsel of the CIA. His name's Larry Houston. And at that time, he said this was culpable negligence. He was a general counsel. And they went on, left a guy on the job who had been guilty, according to their own lawyer, of culpable negligence. What about Helms? We took his deposition, too. It's right here.
Yeah, it's an awful thick deposition. He didn't remember a whole lot. There's a major case of forget-me-it's. The only thing that we really got out of him was that he instructed Gottlieb, the CIA's Dr. Gottlieb, to destroy the records.
Huh. Culpable liability. So why am I talking about a case from the 80s? Well, I've told you, because this is the deep state Donald Trump faces. But also this, posted May 30th, 2024, 9:39 a.m., Pacific date time. Not even a year ago. Supreme Court won't hear appeal in Montreal MK Ultra brainwashing case. So the Supreme Court of Canada will not review a Quebec ruling that bars people in Canada from suing the United States over its role in a notorious brainwashing experiments at a Montreal psychiatric hospital. The top court's decision is a setback for a proposed class action lawsuit over the medical procedures funded decades ago by the Canadian government and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency at the Allen Memorial Institute. They just go through and describe everything we just heard. So it's okay. What about our Supreme Court? Well, they defer all the time to the intelligence services. Remember, FISA. The intelligence services lied to the FISA court. And they did that in order to spy on a presidential campaign. FISA is the most powerful court in America. It's not the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to do things in public. FISA said, we'll give a little bit of a fine and some bothersome stuff to a junior lawyer, but other than that, we don't really care. What about the Department of Justice? Given the clear and evident abuses against Americans who are pro-life. So President Trump's battle is huge, and I think he's fighting it much better, and I know that he deserves our prayers, and I know that we need to pray that he takes the deep state on this way. But everything we just talked about is so utterly evil and so utterly temporary. The spiritual war is permanent. And if you can't describe your enemy, you can't accurately fight him because you don't know what weapons work. In the case of the enemy, there's a weapon that always works, and that is God's word, because the enemy can't stand it. He can't stand people praising God. He hates it. So these are some of the tools we have, the most important tools. And I believe that this stuff all ties together. Destroying the minds of people under the guise of fake medical experiments, to me, is brutally, brutally evil, and I think satanic. So maybe God's word can help us there as well. I think President Trump has been changed and humbled, almost getting to do that for you. I hope he's becoming an expert at using God's word. This is the Todd Herman Show. Please go be well, be strong, be kind, and please make every effort to walk in the light of Christ.